"Ma'am, you're going to have to leave the property." The words landed quietly, but in the polished marble lobby of the Whitmore Grand Hotel, they seemed to echo louder than the soft piano music drifting from the corner bar. A few guests turned their heads. Others pretended not to look, their reflections gliding across the tall glass walls that framed the rainy Chicago night outside. Avery Carter stood still for a moment, rain droplets still clinging to the shoulders of her dark coat. She had arrived only seconds earlier, pulling a modest black suitcase behind her after a 6-hour flight from New York and a 30-minute cab ride through the glowing downtown streets. The lobby smelled faintly of cedarwood and fresh linen. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across the polished floor. Everything about the place whispered luxury. But right now, every eye in the room seemed focused on her. The security guard shifted his stance beside the front desk, not aggressive, not loud, just firm enough to make the message clear. "Sir," a young voice spoke suddenly from behind the luggage cart. She already paid for the room. The boy who said it couldn't have been older than 19. His name tag read Lucas Reed, and the brass buttons on his bellboy uniform caught the chandelier light as he glanced nervously between Avery and the hotel manager standing behind the front desk. Daniel Whitmore barely looked at him. Tall, silver-haired, and dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit, he had the calm confidence of someone used to being the most important person in the room. His expression didn't change as he folded his hands neatly on the counter. "Lucas," he said in a measured tone, "please step away from the desk." The bellboy hesitated, then slowly rolled the luggage cart backward, though his eyes lingered on Avery, as if he felt something about the situation wasn't right. Avery herself hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't argued. In fact, she had only asked one simple thing since stepping through the revolving glass doors less than a minute earlier. "I'd like to check in," she had said calmly. That was it. No complaint, no attitude, no demand. Just a quiet request for the room she had reserved earlier that evening. Yet somehow the temperature in the room had changed the moment she walked up to the desk. Daniel Whitmore studied her again. The way someone might examine a detail that didn't quite belong in an otherwise perfect picture. Her clothes were simple. No designer labels. No expensive jewelry. Her suitcase showed the faint scuffs of real travel instead of the pristine shine of luxury luggage. Outside, rain streaked down the tall front windows in thin silver lines. Inside, the lobby had grown strangely quiet. A couple seated near the fireplace paused their conversation. A businessman waiting for an elevator subtly leaned to get a better view. Avery noticed all of it, but her face remained calm. She simply rested one hand on the handle of her suitcase and looked at the manager across the counter. "Is there a problem with my reservation?" she asked gently. Daniel Whitmore gave a small, polite smile that never reached his eyes. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," he replied. The security guard shifted again beside her. Lucas gripped the edge of the luggage cart a little tighter. And for a brief moment, in the quiet glow of the chandeliers, it felt like the entire hotel lobby was holding its breath. Daniel Whitmore's smile stayed perfectly polite, but the quiet tension around the front desk deepened. The rain outside the tall glass entrance doors continued sliding down in thin silver lines, blurring the bright city lights across Michigan Avenue. Avery Carter remained where she stood, one hand resting calmly on the handle of her suitcase, her posture straight but relaxed. She did not raise her voice. She did not step closer to the desk. She simply waited. The lobby clock mounted above the concierge counter ticked softly, each second passing in a room that had suddenly grown very aware of her presence. Daniel adjusted his cufflinks as if the entire situation were nothing more than a small inconvenience interrupting his evening routine. "Our rooms are reserved for registered guests," he said evenly. "And unfortunately, we do not seem to have a valid reservation under your name." Avery tilted her head slightly, studying the polished marble counter between them. The reflection of the chandelier lights shimmered across its surface like small stars. "That is interesting," she replied in a calm voice that carried easily through the quiet lobby. "Because I made the reservation 3 hours ago." Daniel's expression barely shifted, but his fingers tapped once against the counter before going still again. "I am afraid our system shows no such record." A couple near the fireplace exchanged a glance. The businessman waiting by the elevators checked his watch but continued listening. Behind the luggage cart, Lucas Reed shifted his weight uneasily. He had been working at the Whitmore Grand for just over 2 months, and in that time he had learned that Daniel Whitmore rarely made mistakes. The manager ran the hotel with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades in the business. Yet something about the way Avery stood there made Lucas hesitate. She did not look confused. She did not look embarrassed. If anything, she seemed strangely patient. Avery reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out her phone. The screen lit softly in her hand. Perhaps it was booked under the corporate account, she said. Daniel gave a thin smile. Even so, our reservations require confirmation at check-in. Avery nodded slowly, as if considering that information. The rain continued tapping against the tall windows. Outside, a yellow cab rolled past the entrance, its headlights briefly flashing across the marble floor. Inside, the atmosphere felt heavier with every passing second. Lucas glanced toward the computer monitor behind the desk. The reservation system was still open on the screen. Without thinking, he stepped half a pace forward. "Sir, if you would like, I can check the system again." Daniel did not look at him. "That will not be necessary." The words were not loud, but they carried the quiet firmness of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Lucas stopped moving immediately, though the uneasiness in his chest did not disappear. Avery slipped her phone back into her coat pocket. "So you are saying there are no available rooms tonight?" she asked. Daniel folded his hands together again, perfectly composed. "I am saying that without a reservation, we cannot accommodate you." Avery's eyes drifted briefly around the lobby. The leather chairs by the fireplace. The grand staircase curving up toward the second floor. The brass nameplate mounted beside the concierge desk that read Whitmore Grand Hotel, established 1978. Her gaze lingered on that name for just a moment before returning to the manager in front of her. "That is unfortunate," she said quietly. Daniel inclined his head slightly, already preparing to move the conversation along. "There are several other hotels within a few blocks. I am sure one of them will be able to assist you this evening." The security guard beside the entrance shifted again, waiting for the signal that the situation was over. Lucas looked from Avery to Daniel and back again. Something still did not feel right. Avery rested both hands lightly on the suitcase handle now, her expression thoughtful rather than upset. "Before I go," she said gently, "may I ask you one small question?" Daniel gave a polite nod. "Of course." Avery's eyes settled calmly on the badge clipped neatly to his suit jacket. "Your full name," she said, her voice soft but clear. "It is Daniel Whitmore, correct?" Daniel Whitmore straightened slightly behind the marble counter, the faint smile on his face tightening just a fraction as he followed Avery Carter's gaze toward the silver name badge clipped neatly to his jacket. The polished metal reflected the chandelier light, the engraved letters catching the glow clearly enough for anyone standing nearby to read. Daniel Whitmore, General Manager. For a brief moment the lobby felt even quieter than before, as if the air itself had paused. Daniel lifted his chin with the composed confidence of someone who had introduced himself thousands of times in the same room. "Yes," he replied smoothly. "Daniel Whitmore." Avery nodded once, slowly, almost thoughtfully. The rain outside the glass entrance continued to fall in a steady rhythm, tracing narrow lines across the windows and distorting the city lights into soft gold streaks. Somewhere behind the bar, a piano note drifted across the lobby, gentle and distant. Lucas Reed shifted his hands along the handle of the luggage cart, watching the exchange with growing curiosity. The young bellboy could not explain why, but something about the way Avery stood there made the moment feel important. She was not nervous. She was not angry. She simply seemed to be confirming a detail. Avery's eyes returned to Daniel, calm and steady. "Thank you," she said quietly. Daniel gave a polite nod as if the conversation had reached its natural end. "Now, if there is nothing further, I would suggest." Avery raised one hand slightly, not interrupting sharply, just enough to pause his sentence. The movement was small but precise. Daniel stopped speaking. Several guests nearby leaned subtly closer to hear what would happen next. Avery rested her hand again on the suitcase handle and glanced around the lobby once more, taking in the sweeping staircase, the gleaming marble floor, the tall brass lamps lining the walls. It was the kind of place designed to make an impression on anyone who walked through its doors. Finally, her eyes returned to Daniel Whitmore. "How long have you been managing this hotel?" she asked calmly. The question seemed to catch him slightly off guard. Not enough to break his composure, but enough that his eyebrows lifted a fraction of an inch. 23 years, he replied after a brief pause. His voice carried a quiet pride. My family built this property in 1978. I know every corner of it. Avery nodded again, absorbing the information as if she were listening to something she had already suspected. Lucas noticed that Daniel's shoulders had straightened a little more now, the familiar confidence returning to his posture. Guests often asked about the hotel's history. Daniel enjoyed telling it. It is one of the finest hotels in Chicago, Daniel continued, his voice smooth and practiced. We maintain a certain standard here. Avery looked down briefly at the polished marble floor, then back up at the grand nameplate mounted beside the concierge desk. Whitmore Grand Hotel. Established 1978. Her eyes lingered on the sign for a long moment before she spoke again. That explains a lot, she said quietly. Daniel folded his hands once more. Indeed. The security guard near the entrance shifted his weight again, clearly expecting the conversation to conclude at any moment. Lucas, however, noticed something different. Avery did not reach for the door. She did not turn away. Instead, she slowly reached into her coat pocket again, this time retrieving her phone with deliberate calm. The screen lit softly in her hand. She glanced at it for only a second before lowering it again. Then she looked directly at Daniel Whitmore. Thank you for confirming your name, she said gently. Daniel gave another polite smile, although the air around the desk now felt slightly different, as if an invisible line had just been drawn across the room. You are welcome, he replied. Avery slipped the phone back into her pocket and gave one final glance around the quiet lobby. The chandeliers shimmered above. The rain continued falling outside. Lucas noticed that several guests were now openly watching. Avery rested both hands lightly on the suitcase handle and spoke one last time, her voice calm and almost conversational. Then I suppose we will see how the next few minutes unfold. Daniel Whitmore's polite smile lingered for a moment after Avery Carter spoke, but something in the room had shifted. It was subtle, almost invisible, like the moment before a storm when the air pressure changes and people feel it without understanding why. The chandeliers above continued to glow warmly, casting golden reflections across the marble floor, yet the lobby now felt noticeably quieter than before. Daniel glanced briefly toward the security guard near the entrance, then back at Avery. I believe the situation has already unfolded, he said calmly. Without a confirmed reservation, there is nothing further we can do this evening. Avery did not move. Her hand still rested lightly on the handle of her suitcase, her posture relaxed, almost patient. The rain outside the tall glass doors continued falling steadily, and every so often the headlights of passing cars slid across the lobby floor like slow-moving beams of light. Lucas Reed remained beside the luggage cart, watching the exchange with increasing uncertainty. The young bellboy had replayed the conversation in his mind twice already, trying to understand why Avery had asked the manager's name so deliberately. Guests nearby had stopped pretending not to listen. A woman seated near the fireplace leaned slightly forward in her chair. The businessman by the elevator had not pressed the call button again. Everyone seemed to sense that the moment was not quite finished. Daniel Whitmore straightened the sleeve of his jacket and turned slightly toward the computer monitor behind the desk, as if ready to return to work. Security will assist you to the entrance, he said, still using the same smooth professional tone. The security guard stepped half a pace closer, though he did not reach for Avery or speak. Avery glanced briefly toward the entrance doors where the rain blurred the city lights into long streaks of gold and white. Then she looked back at Daniel. That will not be necessary, she said gently. Daniel paused again, this time just long enough for Lucas to notice. Avery slowly lifted her phone from her coat pocket once more, her movements calm and unhurried. The screen illuminated her face softly in the warm lobby light. She tapped the screen once, then lowered the phone to her side again. You mentioned you have been managing this hotel for 23 years, she said. Daniel nodded slightly, though a faint crease appeared between his brows. That is correct. Avery gave another small nod, as if confirming a fact in her mind. That means you have seen a lot of changes here. Daniel gave a short, confident smile. I have overseen every major improvement this property has made since the late 1990s. Lucas noticed that Daniel's voice had regained its familiar pride. The Whitmore Grand was more than a job to him. It was a legacy. Avery's gaze drifted briefly to the large brass nameplate again before returning to the manager. Legacies can be interesting things, she said quietly. Daniel folded his hands once more, though now his attention was fully on her. I am not sure I follow. Avery did not answer right away. Instead, she looked toward the lobby entrance again. The rain outside had not slowed, but the street beyond the glass doors was suddenly brighter. Headlights approached from the distance, reflecting sharply across the wet pavement. Lucas noticed it first. A long black SUV rolled slowly toward the hotel entrance and came to a smooth stop beneath the canopy. Another vehicle followed behind it. Then a third. The security guard glanced toward the doors instinctively. Daniel Whitmore frowned slightly, clearly not expecting late arrivals in a coordinated convoy. The engine lights reflected across the marble floor as the first SUV's door opened. Avery remained completely still beside her suitcase. Lucas looked from the entrance back to Avery, then to the manager behind the desk. The strange tension that had filled the lobby moments earlier now felt even heavier. Avery Carter finally lifted her eyes to Daniel Whitmore once more and spoke in the same calm voice she had used since the beginning. I believe, she said softly, this is the part where things start to unfold. The quiet lobby of the Whitmore Grand Hotel seemed to hold its breath as the first black SUV settled beneath the entrance canopy, its headlights casting long reflections across the rain-slick pavement outside. For a moment, no one inside moved. The steady sound of rainfall against the tall glass doors continued, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted completely. Daniel Whitmore stared toward the entrance with a slight crease forming between his brows, the confidence that had filled his voice moments earlier now replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He had managed this hotel for more than 2 decades, and unexpected arrivals rarely happened without his knowledge. Lucas Reed noticed the change immediately. The young bellboy leaned slightly forward beside the luggage cart, his eyes moving between the entrance and Avery Carter, standing quietly beside her suitcase. She had not reacted to the arriving vehicles at all. Her posture remained relaxed, her expression calm, as if the scene unfolding outside the doors had already been expected. The security guard near the entrance straightened instinctively, his training kicking in the moment the second SUV pulled to a stop behind the first. Its headlights washed across the lobby floor, briefly illuminating the brass nameplate mounted beside the concierge desk. A third vehicle rolled to a halt behind the others, the soft rumble of engines fading into the rainy night. Guests who had been pretending not to watch were no longer pretending. The couple near the fireplace turned their chairs slightly. The businessman by the elevator stopped checking his watch entirely. Everyone in the room was now focused on the entrance. Daniel Whitmore cleared his throat quietly, attempting to reclaim the controlled atmosphere he was used to maintaining. It appears we have late arrivals, he said, though the words sounded more like a guess than a statement. Avery Carter did not look toward the vehicles. Her eyes remained calmly on Daniel. That happens sometimes, she replied gently. The automatic doors at the front of the lobby slid open with a smooth mechanical whisper. Cool air from the rainy street drifted inside, carrying the scent of wet pavement and city lights. A tall man stepped through the entrance first, closing a black umbrella as he crossed the marble floor. His suit was dark and sharply tailored, the kind worn by someone accustomed to important meetings and quiet authority. 2 others followed closely behind him, each carrying leather briefcases. The security guard watched them approach, then glanced quickly toward Daniel Whitmore as if waiting for instructions. Daniel remained still behind the front desk, his attention fixed on the 3 men walking toward the lobby center. Lucas noticed that Avery Carter had finally turned slightly, though not enough to face the entrance fully. She simply shifted her weight from one foot to the other, resting her hand again on the suitcase handle. The footsteps of the approaching men echoed softly across the polished floor. Their pace was steady, purposeful, and unhurried. The tall man in front scanned the lobby once, his eyes moving across the fireplace, the staircase, the reception desk, and finally stopping on Avery Carter. The moment his gaze reached her, his posture changed instantly. Without hesitation, he stepped directly toward her and spoke in a clear, respectful tone that carried through the silent room. Miss Carter, he said, inclining his head slightly. Thank you for waiting. Lucas felt the tension in the room snap into something entirely different. Daniel Whitmore's expression froze. Avery Carter gave a small, polite nod in return, her voice as calm as it had been since the moment she walked into the lobby. "Good evening," she replied softly. The man beside her opened one of the leather briefcases and withdrew a thin folder. Behind the front desk, Daniel Whitmore straightened slowly, the confident composure he had worn earlier now replaced by a careful stillness. Lucas Reed glanced from the lawyer standing beside Avery to the manager behind the desk, and suddenly realized that whatever was about to happen next was not simply about a missing reservation. The quiet lobby of the Whitmore Grand Hotel seemed to hold its breath as the first black SUV settled beneath the entrance canopy, its headlights casting long reflections across the rain-slick pavement outside. For a moment no one inside moved. The steady sound of rainfall against the tall glass doors continued, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted completely. Daniel Whitmore stared toward the entrance with a slight crease forming between his brows, the confidence that had filled his voice moments earlier now replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He had managed this hotel for more than 2 decades, and unexpected arrivals rarely happened without his knowledge. Lucas Reed noticed the change immediately. The young bellboy leaned slightly forward beside the luggage cart, his eyes moving between the entrance and Avery Carter, standing quietly beside her suitcase. She had not reacted to the arriving vehicles at all. Her posture remained relaxed, her expression calm, as if the scene unfolding outside the doors had already been expected. The security guard near the entrance straightened instinctively, his training kicking in the moment the second SUV pulled to a stop behind the first. Its headlights washed across the lobby floor, briefly illuminating the brass nameplate mounted beside the concierge desk. A third vehicle rolled to a halt behind the others, the soft rumble of engines fading into the rainy night. Guests who had been pretending not to watch were no longer pretending. The couple near the fireplace turned their chairs slightly. The businessman by the elevator stopped checking his watch entirely. Everyone in the room was now focused on the entrance. Daniel Whitmore cleared his throat quietly, attempting to reclaim the controlled atmosphere he was used to maintaining. "It appears we have late arrivals," he said, though the words sounded more like a guess than a statement. Avery Carter did not look toward the vehicles. Her eyes remained calmly on Daniel. "That happens sometimes," she replied gently. The automatic doors at the front of the lobby slid open with a smooth mechanical whisper. Cool air from the rainy street drifted inside, carrying the scent of wet pavement and city lights. A tall man stepped through the entrance first, closing a black umbrella as he crossed the marble floor. His suit was dark and sharply tailored, the kind worn by someone accustomed to important meetings and quiet authority. 2 others followed closely behind him, each carrying leather briefcases. The security guard watched them approach, then glanced quickly toward Daniel Whitmore as if waiting for instructions. Daniel remained still behind the front desk, his attention fixed on the 3 men walking toward the lobby center. Lucas noticed that Avery Carter had finally turned slightly, though not enough to face the entrance fully. She simply shifted her weight from one foot to the other, resting her hand again on the suitcase handle. The footsteps of the approaching men echoed softly across the polished floor. Their pace was steady, purposeful, and unhurried. The tall man in front scanned the lobby once, his eyes moving across the fireplace, the staircase, the reception desk, and finally stopping on Avery Carter. The moment his gaze reached her, his posture changed instantly. Without hesitation, he stepped directly toward her and spoke in a clear, respectful tone that carried through the silent room. "Miss Carter," he said, inclining his head slightly. "Thank you for waiting." Lucas felt the tension in the room snap into something entirely different. Daniel Whitmore's expression froze. Avery Carter gave a small, polite nod in return, her voice as calm as it had been since the moment she walked into the lobby. "Good evening," she replied softly. The man beside her opened one of the leather briefcases and withdrew a thin folder. Behind the front desk, Daniel Whitmore straightened slowly, the confident composure he had worn earlier now replaced by a careful stillness. Lucas Reed glanced from the lawyer standing beside Avery to the manager behind the desk, and suddenly realized that whatever was about to happen next was not simply about a missing reservation. The folder in the lawyer's hand opened with a quiet, deliberate motion that seemed louder than the rain tapping against the tall windows outside. The man standing beside Avery Carter removed a neatly printed document and held it carefully by the edges, as if the paper itself carried weight far beyond its size. The chandeliers above continued to glow across the marble lobby, but the warm light now revealed a change in every face in the room. Lucas Reed noticed Daniel Whitmore's shoulders stiffen behind the front desk. The manager had not moved, yet the confidence that had once filled his posture was slowly being replaced by something far less certain. The tall attorney spoke again, his voice calm and professional. "Miss Carter, we arrived as quickly as possible." Avery gave a small nod, her expression unchanged. "Thank you, Mr. Keller." The lawyer turned slightly so the front desk could see the document clearly. The paper carried the official letterhead of a Chicago-based legal firm known throughout the city's business district. Several guests in the lobby leaned forward without even realizing it. Daniel Whitmore cleared his throat once, attempting to maintain the tone of authority he had used for years. "I am sorry," he said carefully, "but I am not certain why this meeting is taking place in the middle of my lobby." Mr. Keller looked directly at him, the corners of his mouth remaining neutral. "Because, Mr. Whitmore, the matter concerns the ownership of this property." The words settled into the air like a quiet bell. Lucas felt a ripple move through the room. The businessman near the elevator slowly lowered his phone. The couple by the fireplace stopped whispering entirely. Daniel Whitmore blinked once, then again. "Ownership," he repeated, his voice slightly tighter now. Mr. Keller placed the document gently on the marble counter and turned it so that the manager could read the heading printed across the top. "This agreement was finalized earlier this evening at 7:42 p.m. Chicago time," he explained. "The Whitmore Grand Hotel has been legally transferred to its new owner." Daniel stared at the document without touching it. The steady rhythm of rainfall outside continued filling the quiet spaces between every breath in the lobby. Avery Carter rested both hands on the handle of her suitcase, as if she were simply waiting for the last piece of a puzzle to be placed on the table. Lucas noticed that the security guard near the entrance had shifted again, now watching the desk with the same stunned focus as the guests. Daniel Whitmore finally looked up from the document, his eyes moving slowly from the lawyer to Avery Carter. For the first time since she had walked through the revolving doors, he seemed to study her not as an inconvenience, but as a possibility he had not considered. "You are suggesting," he said carefully, "that the ownership has changed tonight." Mr. Keller gave a polite nod. "Yes." Daniel swallowed quietly. The lobby felt even larger now, the high ceiling amplifying every second of silence. Avery Carter stepped forward one small pace toward the desk. The movement was simple, yet it drew every eye in the room. Her voice remained calm, steady, and unmistakably clear. "Mr. Whitmore," she said gently, "I believe you asked earlier why I was standing in this lobby." Daniel did not answer. Avery's eyes met his directly across the marble counter. "I was waiting," she continued softly, "for the paperwork to finish." The rain outside the Whitmore Grand continued to fall steadily, the sound soft but persistent against the tall glass windows that framed the lobby. Inside, the marble floor reflected the warm chandelier light like a quiet lake, but the atmosphere had changed completely. No one in the room was pretending not to watch anymore. Every guest, every staff member, every passing glance had settled on the small space between the front desk and the woman standing calmly beside her suitcase. Daniel Whitmore remained behind the counter, his eyes fixed on the document lying on the polished marble surface. The paper looked ordinary enough, yet the words printed across the top seemed to weigh heavily on the air around him. Lucas Reed felt the silence stretching across the room like a drawn breath that no one wanted to release. The young bellboy had worked enough late shifts to know that hotel lobbies rarely became this quiet unless something important was happening. The attorney beside Avery Carter adjusted the folder in his hands and spoke again in a steady professional voice. "The transfer agreement was completed this evening through Whitaker and Lane Corporate Legal. The documentation has been filed with the Chicago Property Registry and confirmed by the city clerk's office." Daniel Whitmore slowly lifted his gaze from the paper. His voice, when it returned, sounded more careful now. "And the new owner," he said, "is Ms. Carter." Mr. Keller inclined his head slightly. "That is correct." The words settled into the room like a final piece clicking into place. Lucas felt the realization move through the lobby one person at a time. The businessman near the elevator blinked in surprise. The couple by the fireplace exchanged a look of disbelief. Even the security guard near the entrance straightened his posture as if unsure how to respond. Avery Carter had not raised her voice once since entering the building. She had not argued. She had not demanded attention. She simply stood beside her suitcase, calm and patient, as though the last 10 minutes had unfolded exactly the way she expected. Daniel Whitmore drew in a slow breath. The quiet composure he had carried for years now replaced with something far more uncertain. His eyes moved from the legal document to Avery Carter, studying her with a new awareness that had not been there before. "You purchased the property tonight," he said carefully. Avery gave a small nod. "Yes." Daniel glanced briefly toward the brass nameplate mounted on the wall beside the concierge desk, the one that had displayed the Whitmore name for decades. For the first time since Avery walked through the revolving doors, he seemed to see the lobby from a different perspective. The marble floor, the grand staircase, the reception desk he had stood behind for more than 20 years. Avery stepped forward slightly until she stood directly across the counter from him. Her voice remained calm, but there was a quiet authority in it now that had not needed to announce itself earlier. "Earlier this evening," she said gently, "I decided to stop by and see the property in person." Daniel did not speak. Avery glanced briefly around the lobby before returning her attention to him. "I thought it would be interesting to check in the same way any guest would." Lucas felt the words land softly but firmly across the room. Daniel Whitmore lowered his eyes for a moment before looking back up again. Avery Carter rested one hand on the handle of her suitcase and spoke with the same steady tone she had used from the beginning. "Instead," she continued quietly, "I learned quite a bit about how this place is being run." The quiet that followed Avery Carter's words seemed to stretch across the entire lobby like a held breath. The rain outside continued falling steadily, each drop tracing soft lines down the tall windows that looked out over Michigan Avenue. Inside the Whitmore Grand, the chandeliers cast warm light across the marble floor, but the atmosphere had shifted into something far more serious than a normal evening at the front desk. Daniel Whitmore stood motionless behind the counter, the document still resting on the polished marble in front of him. For more than 23 years, he had managed this hotel with the confidence of someone who believed he understood every detail of its operation. Yet in this moment, the ground beneath that certainty felt far less solid. Lucas Reed could feel the tension from where he stood beside the luggage cart. The young bellboy had watched hundreds of guests walk through the revolving doors during his short time working here, but he had never seen the lobby fall this silent. Even the couple by the fireplace had stopped whispering. Everyone was listening. Avery Carter remained calm. Her posture was relaxed, her hands resting lightly on the handle of her suitcase, as if she were simply waiting for the next step to arrive. The attorney beside her closed the folder carefully and stepped back half a pace, allowing the focus of the room to return to the woman who now owned the property. Daniel Whitmore finally spoke, his voice measured but noticeably quieter than before. "Ms. Carter," he said slowly, "if there has been a misunderstanding tonight, I would be glad to address it." Avery looked at him steadily across the desk. "There has not been a misunderstanding," she replied gently. Daniel drew a slow breath. "Then perhaps we should discuss the situation privately." Avery considered the suggestion for a moment, her eyes briefly drifting across the lobby once more. She saw the staff standing quietly near the concierge desk. She saw the security guard near the entrance. She saw Lucas Reed watching nervously beside the luggage cart. Then her gaze returned to Daniel Whitmore. "This lobby is where the situation began," she said softly. "It seems appropriate that it ends here as well." Daniel did not respond immediately. Lucas noticed that the manager's hands had tightened slightly against the edge of the marble counter. Avery Carter took one calm step forward until she stood directly across from him. Her voice remained steady, neither angry nor dramatic, but clear enough for everyone in the room to hear. "When I walked into this hotel tonight," she said, "I was treated like someone who did not belong here." The words hung quietly in the air. Avery glanced briefly toward the brass nameplate mounted on the wall beside the concierge desk. "Whitmore Grand Hotel. Established 1978. Then she looked back at the man who had managed the building for decades. "A hotel is not defined by marble floors or chandeliers," she continued. "It is defined by how people are welcomed when they walk through the door." Lucas felt the message land across the room more strongly than any raised voice could have done. Daniel Whitmore lowered his eyes for a moment before lifting them again. Avery Carter's expression did not change. She spoke one final sentence with the same calm authority she had carried since the beginning of the night. "Mr. Whitmore," she said gently, "your services as general manager will no longer be required." The rain continued falling outside, but inside the Whitmore Grand, no one spoke. The silence itself seemed to acknowledge that something important had just changed.